In today's episode, bear hugs become a cause of death. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to The Lore Line. Elizabeth Johnson knew that her roommate, Paula Weldon, hadn't been feeling herself for several days. It was the 1st of December, 1946, and it seemed that the combined effects of the cold Vermont air as well as the winter's early sunsets were getting to the 18-year-old Bennington College sophomore. And the stress of looming finals wasn't helping either. Explaining that some fresh air and exercise might help to alleviate her mild melancholy, Paula told Elizabeth at lunch that a quick hike might be just the thing to help her focus on her studies later that Sunday evening, something that was not uncharacteristic of the botany-enthused art major. With that, she buttoned up her red parka, laced up her thick-soled sneakers, and headed out of her Dewey Hall dorm room and into the chilly New England afternoon. But Paula didn't come home that night, nor did she turn up for her classes the next morning, something that was distinctly out of character, as was the fact that she didn't sign out when she left campus. It didn't take the school long to realize that something was wrong, and by noon on Monday, admissions director Mary Garrett made a call to state's attorney William Travers Jerome Jr. to request assistance in locating the missing teenager. It's unclear why she called him in particular, but it might have had something to do with Bennington College's reputation as a safe place for women to study and the lack of a Vermont state police force. Not that the Vermont State Police Force has a great record on finding missing teenage girls, but that's not the point. In this case, it was probably that it wouldn't look good to lose a student from an affluent Connecticut family like the Weldons, and organizing a search effort wasn't going to be as simple as putting out an APB. Whatever the case, the local response was more immediate. Led by a local farmer named Henry Steele, a group of employees from the school made their way out into the woods south of the college. Paula was known to enjoy spending time outdoors, and had recently mentioned to classmates that she wanted to visit Everett Cave at the foot of nearby Mount Anthony. Since Elizabeth had mentioned that Paula planned to go hiking, that seemed as good a place as any to start. But after a few hours spent searching the trails leading to and around the cavern, they found no sign that she had been there. With darkness falling, there was little else that could be done regarding a ground search, and so the school and other involved authorities turned to the next best thing, that being the media. A broadcast Monday evening carried the description of Miss Weldon, reported the Bennington Evening Banner on Tuesday, December 3rd, and by the following morning, scores of photos of the missing student had been circulated throughout New England. Admirably, in spite of the darkness and the inherent danger involved in traveling the mountain trails through it, a number of Paula's friends made the daring decision to go searching in small groups through Mount Anthony and McCullough Woods, where the missing student had mentioned that she wanted to hike. That same Tuesday, the search kicked into high gear, with 300 of the college's students combing Glastonbury Mountain after local farmers reported seeing a girl matching Paula's description at 4:30 p.m. on Sunday, heading up a route called the Long Trail, which is now part of the Appalachian Trail. Paula's father, W. Archibald Weldon, arrived from Stamford and quickly began collecting information, working closely with Bennington College president Lewis Jones. The radio broadcast had been a mild success, and that morning a cab driver named Abe Ruskin came forward to report that he'd given a girl from the college a ride to the local bus station. That was both good news and bad news, since it meant that she probably wasn't lost in the woods, but it also meant that she could have boarded any number of the afternoon's buses to Pittsfield, New York, or Burlington. Then again, when shown a picture of the missing student, Ruskin became uncertain that she was in fact the girl he'd seen the previous day. Paula was distinctively attractive, a 5-foot 5-inch tall blonde with blue eyes and a slim build, but then again, so were many of the girls attending the privately owned, women's-only liberal arts college. With that, concerns that she may have met some accident in the woods while on her hike resurfaced, with faculty, friends, and family fearing that the girl may have perhaps suffered injuries in a fall, while officials began to suspect that she may have been a victim of amnesia. Her father didn't think that was very likely, however, as she had no history of head injuries or other mental illnesses beyond what appeared to be a recent bout of seasonal depression. He also didn't think that she'd taken a bus out of town, not only because he couldn't think of any reason why she would, or because none of her belongings were missing from her room, but also because nobody at the bus terminal could recall seeing her there either. There was some talk of her leaving either with or to go see a boy at Williams College, an all-boys school a little over 15 miles south of Bennington College, but Weldon shot that down too. While he was aware that she had been in attendance at social functions there, the father said that these boys were only chums, and that he knew she wasn't serious about them. And her friends seemed to back that up, telling investigators and reporters that while she knew and liked a number of boys, she was not particularly interested in any of them. Mary Garrett, the admissions director, agreed, saying that she was not the type that spent much time going away to dances, and that on every occasion in the past when Miss Weldon left the Bennington campus, she had always signed out as the rules require. The boys themselves even seemed to be on the same page, as the New York Daily News reported on the 4th that the young men in Bennington and at nearby Williams College, with whom Paula had had dates, could give no further information. The Brattleboro Reformer, on the other hand, brought headlines placing her in Boston. A New Haven Railroad employee reported that he'd seen her on a passenger train in Springfield, Massachusetts, and a waitress in Boston reported that she was absolutely sure that she had seen Paula when a girl matching her description came in to apply for a job. Whether by journalistic error or a change in the story, however, the Bennington Evening Banner reported on the following day that Paula wasn't looking for a job. Instead, the story was that a waitress named Aura Pelletier served a girl she believed wholeheartedly to be Paula at the Modern Restaurant in Fall River around 9:30 p.m. on Monday, and that she was there with a man who appeared to be 25 years old. He was heavyset, though for the time that probably means of average size in today's terms, stood about 5 feet 8 inches tall, and had appeared intoxicated and abusive towards his female companion. When the man went up to pay the bill, Aura told Fall River Police, the girl called her over and asked how far it was to Bennington, and how she might be able to get back there. She then explained that she had arrived in Fall River that morning, and that while she'd come to town with $1,000 in cash, she had none left. If she did explain her connection to the man she was with, that part didn't reach the papers. But the police considered Aura's story plausible enough to investigate further. Massachusetts state troopers and the Fall River Police actually did manage to track down witnesses who recalled a man matching Aura's description, including a clothing store manager named John Proud, who recalled that on the previous Saturday he had sold a red and black checkered hat, some scarves and socks, and a pair of rubbers, most likely meaning boots rather than contraceptives, to a group of 3 men. The one in question reportedly said that he was a photography student in New Haven, and that he and his friends planned to go hiking that weekend, which could have placed them in Vermont by Sunday afternoon. The story was a little odd overall, and some of the details made very little sense, an opinion that seems to have been shared by Vermont State Attorney William Jerome Jr., who believed that the best lead was the series of witness statements placing Paula on Glastonbury Mountain that Sunday. And by the time the Reformer went to print on the 4th, at least 6 persons reported they had seen the girl on the long trail that afternoon. Regarding the sighting reported by the cab driver, Abe Ruskin, Jerome told the Reformer that they had witnesses who saw her after he is reported to have picked his fare up. The mountain lead was bolstered the following day, with the Evening Banner reporting that they conducted an interview with a contractor who lived outside of Bennington. Lewis Knapp came forward after reading the Tuesday issue of the paper, when he realized that he had given a ride to a hitchhiker who matched Paula's description on the afternoon that she disappeared. And according to a much later article in The Reformer, dated to February 18, 1947, Knapp had been on his way past Bennington College when, just before 3 p.m., he was hailed by a girl he was positive was Paula Weldon. He gave a perfectly accurate description of the clothes worn by the missing sophomore, down to the unreported color of her shoes, but for one specific detail. He said that she was wearing a brown parka. It was only after a subsequent visit to the home by Detective Shelby Williams that investigators discovered the reason for that error. When Williams asked Knapp what color several red items in the room, including his own scarf, were, Knapp answered brown, and thus everyone in the room discovered that he was, in fact, colorblind. And just in case that sounds unlikely that somebody would find out they're colorblind that late in life, I found out I was colorblind at the age of 19 while enlisting in the National Guard. I got a 6 out of 14 on the colorblindness test. Interestingly enough, when I brought this up to my mother, she told me that she knew I was colorblind the whole time, but hadn't wanted me to feel limited as a child. And I will say that actually explained several discussions I had in high school where my friends insisted I was wearing green, and I was very certain I was wearing blue. In any case, according to Knapp's account, Paula wasn't particularly talkative throughout the ride, but as they approached Bennington proper, she asked if they were headed out on Route 9. He replied that they were, and quoted Paula as replying, "I'm trying to get up to the Long Trail." Knapp took her as far as his own home, just over the Furnace Bridge, at which point she got out and said, "Thanks, that's swell." The witness said that he then went inside to wash up for dinner, told his wife and daughter that he'd given a girl a ride from the college, and then it would seem that the little girl went outside to see who Dad had brought home with him. Now, the reporting is unclear, but it does say that Mrs. Knapp had to call her in from the front yard. and that Knapp's daughter reported upon re-entering the house that she had not seen any girl on the road. So somehow, in the 3 or 4 minutes since Paula left the car, she'd managed to get far enough down the street that she disappeared from view, though the paper seems to have exaggerated the distance until someone would reasonably be out of sight as half a mile. Looking even at modern maps, the road curves enough to obscure it from view every 1,500 feet or so at basically any point along that stretch of Route 9, but still it was possible that somebody else had picked her up and given her a ride to her ultimate destination, though nobody came forward to report giving her a ride, as would be expected if she were abducted. That angle seemed more likely after reports surfaced on Thursday, December 4th, that a dark maroon car with Connecticut plates and carrying a man and a girl answering to Paula Weldon's description was seen in the Woodford Hollow area, just west of the Long Trail. Further supporting the possibility that this was in fact Paula was the report of one Ernie Whitman, a night watchman who actually worked for the Evening Banner and lived in Woodford Hollow, and told his colleagues that he met her in the Hollow at 4 p.m. on Sunday afternoon. Whitman reported that she asked him the way to the Long Trail and that he gave her directions. He believed that she must have gone up the Long Trail because 3 friends with him saw the girl hiker cross a bridge, which went nowhere but the trail in question. One thing that should be mentioned is that on modern maps, this actually isn't part of the Long Trail anymore. Instead, it's now an unmarked and apparently unnamed trail leading to the South Glastonbury charcoal kilns, and shortly thereafter reconnecting with the current trail. Regardless of the modern path, however, several other residents of Woodford Hollow corroborated Whitman's story, reporting that they'd seen the girl in the vicinity of the Fay Fuller Camp, a trail shelter, that afternoon. All of this pointed very heavily towards the possibility that Paula was somewhere along that trail or near to it, and on Thursday the 4th, a group of around 125 students, faculty, and locals volunteered to scour the mountain, while another 120 members of the Vermont State Guard were expected to bolster their ranks. At least 5 aircraft also participated, 2 of which were offered by a family friend of the Weldons who had employed Paula at his art studio in the past. And searchers were very confident that this effort would be successful, including Bennington College President Lewis Jones, who the Evening Banner reported was sure that Paula Weldon would be found in the Long Trail region, and that he was rather inclined to believe this rather than any of the many leads which led authorities all over New England. But then, rather suddenly, that ceased to be the case. On Friday, December 6, 1946, the Caledonian Record published an article stating that State's Attorney William T. Jerome announced that authorities had abandoned a mountain hunt for the girl and that a national police broadcast was being arranged in an effort to obtain clues. For some reason, the search had completely reoriented around something that authorities had, to that point, leaned away from: foul play. The Caledonian Record didn't give any particular reason, but referenced the report of Ora Pelletier out of Fall River, the maroon car, and a small truck observed on the mountain trail where Paula was last seen. Additionally, they were investigating the possibility that she left of her own accord, though the paper supplied no reasoning for that consideration. Stranger still, the Montpelier Evening Argus reported on the following day that there is no direct evidence of foul play, and there is no evidence that any foul play took place on Glastonbury Mountain's Long Trail. But despite this, they were now following a theory that it must have taken place. The answer to the question of why the sudden change, however, may lie within an article in the December 10th issue of the Holyoke Transcript Telegram, headlined "Vermont Forced to Stop Search for Lost Girl." As it would seem, there really wasn't any evidence that Paula had met with foul play out on the trail or elsewhere. There was no further reporting on the lead out of Fall River, which never really made sense in the first place. If Paula had been kidnapped and had the wherewithal to ask somebody for help, why would she have stopped short of asking the waitress to call the police? Furthermore, the likelihood of a stranger abduction in the middle of nowhere, especially by somebody not familiar with the area in which it happened, is extraordinarily low. No, it seems that the reason for their insistence upon foul play was instead a matter of investigative necessity, because if they just called it a missing persons case, then they couldn't keep the limited police resources Vermont had assigned to the case. As Detective Alma B. Franzoni told the paper, "We just don't have the authority to continue." To that end, one lead in particular stood out: a report of a girl matching Paula's description, sitting in the passenger seat of a blue coupe with Connecticut plates, and belonging to one John Bush. Bush, as it turned out, had been in Bennington on the date of the disappearance, and told several persons that he had a date with a beautiful blonde. But 4 days later, papers were not even mentioning his name, though it did seem that the gambit had paid off, at least for a time. Connecticut investigators loaned to Vermont due to the Green Mountain State's lack of manpower and quite a bit of prodding from Paula's father, turned over every stone, pledging to question every person who has been within 50 feet of Paula during the 2 weeks before she disappeared. 3 days later, they were excavating a gravel pit close by to the college. The following day, the reports were that she wasn't there. It seems that the truth of the matter was that they had no idea where Paula had gone. They just knew that they had to keep looking. Finally, on the 20th, the Connecticut cops found something that could have pointed towards Paula's whereabouts, when a Brattleboro man came forward with the first concrete clue that would bring Paula Weldon down off the long trail where she was last seen. The man and his wife, who asked to remain anonymous, told investigators that while driving from Arlington to Brattleboro, they had seen footprints in the snow off of Route 9, some distance east of the entrance to the long trail. It was late at night, shortly before 12 a.m., and they explained that they had only seen the tracks because they stopped to put chains on their tires. And the wife had found it odd that the small shoe prints lacked an elevated heel. And if you'll recall, Paula was said to be wearing sneakers. Curious and concerned, they followed the prints for some 400 yards before they abruptly stopped, indicating that whoever this was, and potentially Paula, might have been picked up by a passing motorist. And they had seen a car going in the opposite direction just a few minutes prior to their decision to stop. To strengthen the theory that Paula might have been wandering listlessly around the Long Trail District, the Bennington Evening Banner continued, evidence was reviewed which Mrs. Archie Barbeau gave previously. Apparently, the woman, who lived about a mile away from where the footprints were seen, had reported seeing snow tracks in the rear of her home the morning after Paula vanished. Soon after that December 20th report, however, the holidays came, and both the search and the news of it slowed to a crawl. When news of the investigation did pick back up in early January, it was for good reason. The newly elected governor, Ernest Gibson, wanted a complete report on the investigation with the stated goal of ascertaining whether any loopholes could be found in the mass of clues accumulated during the 38 days the case had been in existence. Rewards were raised from $2,000 to $5,000, the Evening Banner offered to print posters, and the Connecticut detectives were ordered back into the case. But as the days turned into weeks, no news arose about the missing student. By mid-February, Private Detective Raymond Schindler, who was brought in by the Stamford Advocate, was ever more confident that Paula met with foul play, though he wasn't entirely closed off to the idea that Paula may have taken a wrong turn after leaving the Glastonbury Mountain area, and could have ended up on another branch of the Long Trail, which led south to Sucker Pond, today known as Lake Hancock. But February turned into March, and March turned into April, all without any further leads coming to fruition, though clamor for a state police force was steadily gaining traction. Every now and then, someone would show up who appeared to match Paula's description, but in each and every case, it turned out to be a misidentification. At least until December of 1947, a full year after her disappearance, when South Carolina police detained a young woman after a tourist camp operator linked her with a picture of the missing Weldon girl. Police Lieutenant Julian T. Williams told the press that the girl, who went by several names, fit the description of Paula Weldon almost perfectly, but that she refused to acknowledge having any connection with her doppelganger in the North. Police, however, had a very hard time believing her. Not only did she look the part down to a scar above her knee, but she had first appeared at the camp under the name of Mary Weldon. According to the Rutland Daily Herald, she then disappeared for several days before checking back in, this time under the name of Mary Garrett, which was, if you'll recall, the name of the admissions director of Bennington College. But despite the uncanny similarity in both appearance and given names, the girl insisted that she was from St. Louis, Missouri, and repeatedly evaded Lieutenant Williams' questions. Still, the only differences between the girl in custody, so far as anybody could tell, were the color of her eyes, which were brown rather than blue, and her southern accent. The latter being the aspect which led Paula's mother to say that she was thoroughly convinced the girl is not my daughter. By New Year's Eve, the headline in the White River Herald read, "Another Paula Weldon clue proves a fizzle," after authorities established that the new suspect was not the missing Paula. In the years that followed, clues would now and again arise which pointed in some direction or another, and each time they would prove to be nothing but dead ends. In the end, police came to the conclusion that she must have met with foul play simply because no other option seemed plausible. Even to this day, no trace of Paula's clothing or other remains have shown themselves on that solemn, now unkempt and disrepaired trail along Glastonbury Mountain, and no reasonable suspect was ever brought in for questioning regarding her disappearance. Paula Weldon had seemingly vanished into the void without a single person in the world able to track her down, and absolutely nobody knows why. But there are some who think they may have an idea. But before we get to what that idea was, I need to tell you that we actually don't have an ad slot for today, so if you want to check out our merch at bunkerbranding.com or get our coffee from Tableau Roasting Co., the links are in the description and we would appreciate if you did so. The chill of the late November air stung the skin of Forrest Hewitt's face as he trudged through the knee-high snow of the southern Vermont wilderness, scanning the thick blanket of white for any sign of life or limb as he searched for Carl Herrick. Somewhere out in these woods, his cousin had disappeared, the last traces of his tracks swept away by plows as they crossed a lonely forest road. But as the morning light grew, Forrest's eye caught something. He pressed forward until he could make out for certain the cap and coat of his missing relative, the faint spots of gray peeking through the endless drifts of fresh snow. The body still and silent, it was clear that the worst had come to pass, and with that confirmation, Forrest called the other searchers over to do what they could to honor their fallen friend, identify the cause of his death. At first, it would have seemed that Carl must have frozen in the sub-zero temperatures overnight, but that didn't really make much sense. He was just 3 miles from home, hunting the very same land as he had for nearly all of his 38 years on this earth. Moreover, he was exactly where he said he would be, dismissing any notion that he had become lost when he left his house 3 days prior. And then they saw the tracks. Massive prints in the snow surrounded the woodsman's body, which, upon closer inspection, bore the marks of an animal's claws. But why would a black bear have attacked him? When Forrest spied his cousin's rifle, it began to come together. Some 70 feet away, the weapon rested against a tree, a single round in the magazine, and an empty casing on the ground beside it. Given the evidence, Hewitt and the other searchers came to the conclusion that Herrick must have shot at the bear, hence the empty casing beside the firearm. He then set the rifle down and approached the animal, thinking it dead and planning to field dress it, only for the bear to suddenly get up, grab him, and then, well, that's the weird part. There was no evidence that the beast had mauled him, nor did it seem that it had any interest in making a meal of the experienced hunter. And, of course, the bear was nowhere to be seen. And while there were scratches on his arms, hands, and face, the fatal injury wasn't a bite or a deep laceration. Instead, Hewitt found that Carl's face was darkened, and County Coroner Dr. C.G. Otis would find on autopsy just a few days later that his cause of death was internal bleeding. So the only conclusion that anyone could come up with was that Carl Herrick had been squeezed so badly that a lung was ruptured, causing a hemorrhage, something that is, so far as I can tell, utterly unheard of. Not only that, but newspaper reports from the time claim that the searchers also thought that the bear once dropped him and then returned to squeeze him again before leaving the scene. Beyond the fact that it's highly unusual for a bear to choose to squeeze somebody to death, it also seems rather odd that a hunter as experienced as Carl would make the rookie mistake of leaving his gun behind to approach a large predatory animal that he had not yet confirmed was actually dead. Regardless, there was no other explanation for how Carl might have met his end, and so it was written off as a freak tragedy caused by the woodsman's own lack of attention to procedure. But then, something strange began happening. 2 years later, in November of 1945, a 74-year-old hunter named Mitty Rivers vanished in Bickford Hollow, some 20 miles away from West Townshend, where Carl Herrick had met his end. Then, a year later, 18-year-old Paula Weldon disappeared after being last seen in the very same place. And 3 years to the day after that, in 1949, 68-year-old James Tedford stepped off a bus while on his way to nearby Bennington, never to be seen again. And within a year, 8-year-old Paul Jepson went missing from a dump in the same town. Finally, the series of strange disappearances came to an end when the body of 53-year-old Frida Langer was recovered in May of 1951, after she was last seen in October of the previous year. All 6 incidents occurred within the general vicinity of Glastonbury Mountain, all between October and December, and 3 of them happened within 5 miles of the town of Bennington. and as a result, the area has come to be known as the Bennington Triangle. Now, of the cases that make up the so-called Bennington Triangle disappearances, that of Paula Weldon is arguably the best known, but it isn't necessarily any more mysterious than all of the others. Take Mitty Rivers, for example, who vanished on November 12, 1945. Much like Herrick, he was a man who had spent his life hunting in the area where he ultimately went missing. But unlike Herrick, he was never found. Newspapers covered the disappearance frequently, but not extensively. We know that he was traveling with his son-in-law, Joe Loutzen Jr., and that the pair separated at the Forks, apparently a place on Bowles Brook near the old ghost town of Glastonbury. And according to the Bennington Evening Banner, the old hunter told his companion that he only planned to go off a short distance and would be back before lunch, with Joe Jr. warning him not to go over the ridge into Bickford Hollow, the very same place where Paula Weldon walked onto the long trail. Now, it wasn't that there was anything particularly dangerous about Bickford Hollow, just that Rivers wasn't particularly familiar with the area, but the old man felt that he knew his way around the forest well enough to make it back to his starting point without much effort. Apparently, he didn't. When he wasn't back by his 3 p.m. lunchtime, his relatives became worried and fanned off into the forest searching for him. They shouted, fired their rifles, and tried to conceptualize where he might have gotten off to, but it was to no avail, and so the Loutzens turned to the authorities for assistance. At first, the search fell into the hands of the local fire chief, Wallace Madison, but within a week, the Vermont State Guard and a detachment of U.S. Army soldiers were deployed to the forests. But despite a massive organized effort in what truly was a very limited area, no trace of the man could be found, and the official search was abandoned on November 20th, after a heavy snowfall rendered much of the area impassable. Though small-scale volunteer searches continued throughout the winter, it would be months before any evidence as to the fate of Mitty Rivers surfaced in May of 1946. A single blue handkerchief with a small amount of money wrapped inside. The woman who found it was not searching, and ironically enough was on a hike at the foot of Bickford Hollow when she discovered it. And interestingly enough, the piece of fabric was positively identified as belonging to Rivers because an ink stain matched the kind of ink Rivers handled at his job with Benmont Papers, which was completely unique to that location. Despite the find, however, no further trace of the man could be found, which is incredibly odd, given that Bickford Hollow Brook leads right into Woodford Hollow and Route 9 on the one end, and the long trail at its confluence with Bowles Brook leads right back up towards the aforementioned Forks near Glastonbury on the other. Furthermore, the Glastonbury Fire Tower, a towering 50-foot steel structure built in 1926, stands atop Glastonbury Mountain and is right along the same trail. So, since he managed to miss all of these landmarks, and given the man's age, it seems most likely that a medical event was the cause of his failure to return to camp. But that doesn't explain the lack of a body. You see, the handkerchief was found in a populated area, with roads and homes right there. If Rivers had felt like he lost his way, he could have easily gone for help at any of the nearby houses, or followed the road back towards Bennington. He should have known not to try his luck getting back up the mountain, but even if he did attempt it, he would have done so by following either one of the streams, or the trail which led right back to the part of the forest he was familiar with, and thus his body should have been somewhere along one of those paths. Instead, he was nowhere to be found, and the only real explanation anyone could think of besides a heart attack was that he'd been killed accidentally by another hunter, and his body hidden away to escape consequences. When Paula Weldon vanished the following year, many of the articles referenced the mysterious disappearance of Mitty Rivers almost exactly 12 months prior, and the same treatment was applied when James Tedford vanished 3 years to the day after Paula. The World War I vet was returning home from a visit to his wife in Franklin, not far from where Brianna Maitland would go missing 55 years later, and was last seen getting off of a bus from St. Albans to the soldiers' home in Bennington. Tedford and his wife lived apart due to his struggles with an unspecified mental illness, and when he didn't turn back up at his Bennington residence, authorities launched a search effort. Of course, they were a week late getting started, because the soldiers' home failed to notify anyone of his disappearance for a full 7 days. By the 16th, the search had shifted to Brandon, Vermont, after witnesses there claimed they'd seen someone matching his description acting queerly on one of the town's main streets, which is something that means an entirely different thing today. Tedford was sadly never found, though unlike the previous 3, the details of his story don't exactly leave any room for imagination as to what happened. He got off a bus in the wrong town, either deliberately or by accident, and nobody thought to, go grab him and take him somewhere where he could be treated for what was Clearly some sort of mental illness. But the same cannot be said for 8-year-old Paul Jepson, who went missing the following October while his mother was moving pigs at the town dump, of which she and her husband were reportedly the caretakers. According to the Bennington Evening Banner, they also kept about 65 pigs on the property, and they went to move them between pens daily. She told investigators that she was gone only 30 minutes, and when she returned to her truck, Paul was no longer sitting where she left him in the cab. And now I know what you're all thinking, but they brought bloodhounds in and the dogs picked up a trail leading away from the dump and to the intersection of East and Chapel. From there, however, the trail went cold. The two prevailing theories were that the boy had been abducted by an opportunistic predator, though that term didn't exist at the time and they had no evidence to support the theory, or that he had potentially run away of his own accord. And that is something that one of the papers said he had done before, and yet for some reason when I went back to look for that paper, I couldn't find it. Now, this string of disappearances finally seems to have come to an end with the death of Frida Langer, who disappeared just 16 days after Paul Jepson, though she was about 14 miles away as the crow flies over Glastonbury Mountain and in the area of Somerset Reservoir. As the story went, she was last seen by her cousin, Herbert Elsner, after she slipped into a brook while accompanying him on a hike near her husband's hunting camp. Due to the late October cold, she chose to return to camp to change into warm, dry clothes, but she never made it there, which is a story much like that of Garrett Bardsley. But where Garrett Bardsley had disappeared around 9 in the morning, in this case, it was about an hour before dusk at the time of separation, and authorities believe that she may have gotten lost trying to take a shortcut back to camp, only to end up off-trail in the dark. That belief was validated in May of 1951, when her decomposed body was recovered from the reservoir 3.5 miles away from where she was last seen alive. There was no evidence of foul play, and she was identified at the scene via a steel cap in her skull, which had been placed there after the removal of a brain tumor several years prior. With that, the Bennington Triangle disappearances, at least the original ones, came to an end, and to be honest, I am quite confused as to why they were considered mysterious to begin with. At least when you look at the last 3 of them. As you can see, I spent a lot more time on the first 3, and for what I would argue is good reason. James Tedford was a mentally unwell old man who was known to dislike living in the soldiers' home, and their failure to report him missing gives me an idea as to why. Paul Jepson was referred to as mentally disabled in several articles. One said that he'd run away several times in the past, he was last seen at a dump filled with pigs, disappeared from the side of a country road, and his dad was recently elected the town tax collector. It's a cornucopia of possibilities, but none of them are paranormal. And to be clear, while we here at the Lodge do not recognize IRS agents as people, we do believe their children should be off limits. Then there's Frida Langer, who is probably the least mysterious of any of them. But as for Carl Herrick, Mitty Rivers, and Paula Weldon, those are a bit less understandable. Sure, all 3 do have mundane explanations, but none of them feel necessarily likely. Carl might have made a mistake while hunting a bear, but what kind of bear picks somebody up, suplexes him, picks him up again, and then squeezes him to death? Mitty might have gotten lost or had a medical event, but then again, his last known whereabouts were literally in a neighborhood with people and roads all around him. Paula, however, is the one that I really just can't wrap my head around. It is possible that she walked off into the night of her own accord, or that she chose to accept a ride with a stranger off to who knows where, but doing so would suggest that she intended to disappear, because, as we know, she was last seen at her destination. The intentional disappearance angle wouldn't be out of the question for a young adult, but Paula was attractive, intelligent, wealthy, and outside of the few days before she disappeared, apparently very content with her life. None of her friends suggested there had been a boy she might have run off with. Her parents didn't seem to think that she was interested in anybody either. And outside of the fact that she decided to go hiking an hour and a half before nightfall, and that she didn't sign out when she usually did, there's nothing out of the ordinary about what she was doing. In the 1940s, hitchhiking was not really seen as the very dangerous activity that it is today, so hitchhiking's not out of the ordinary. Some have suggested that this was a mental illness of some kind, and that she was at the age where those things start to show their signs. But then again, nobody had seen any other signs, and while she was not talkative, as she was described, she also wasn't despondent. One suggestion I saw was that she might have been developing bipolar disorder and might have been going through a manic period after a depressive period, but again, the way that Knapp described her was not manic. In fact, it was more depressive than anything. And also, she told people that she planned on going somewhere. If she was going through a mental health crisis or she was intentionally planning to disappear, why would she tell people exactly where she planned to go? I mean, I guess not exactly. She said she was going for a hike, but then she went for a hike. Once again, this is one of those cases where it's not that there's no possible explanation. It's just that the only reasonable explanation isn't that reasonable. Is it less reasonable than Bigfoot or portals or alien abduction? Absolutely not. But I don't like it. And that's the real reason that her story made up the bulk of this video. I genuinely don't have an idea what would have happened. It's just kind of bizarre. And when you look at what happened to Carl Herrick, and when you look at how Mitty Rivers just completely vanished, you do have to consider that maybe something weird was happening. Just, it's hard to say what it would have been. And of course, leaving Paula aside, Mitty Rivers and Carl Herrick's disappearances happened 20 miles apart from one another in a very densely forested area in the 1940s. The likelihood that they are connected is slim, at least if it's because of a human killer. And that's especially when you consider the fact that Carl's injuries do not sound like a human killer. One thing that Thornbury suggested when I was kind of bouncing ideas off of him was that maybe the bear sat on Carl and that's what caused the injuries. But again, the newspapers and the coroner and everybody all pretty explicitly said it seemed like he had been squeezed to death. So if there is one case we've covered where the most likely cause of death is Bigfoot, it would be that one. I'm not going to say it was Bigfoot because I'm not a certain someone. Then again, he never actually... Am I becoming him? Oh, God. I know it does sound a little insensitive, but I will remind you that this is what I do for a living. But it was kind of nice to come across one that's actually mysterious for once. Usually I'm just traumatizing myself over and over again. At least this time the trauma was a good story. But you know, with that, I don't have any further thoughts. I wish that this is going to sound awful again. I wish this had happened 20 or 30 years ago instead of 70, because 70, 60 time? 60 years. I can do math. But I wish this had happened more recently because then there might be more to go on. Like 20 years after this happens, 25 years after this, 24 years, 25, somewhere in that range, we get Dennis Martin, and there is a treasure trove of information on that. Stacey Aris, it's the same thing with all the National Parks files. And even with the stuff that didn't happen in parks and wasn't extensively documented by a federal agency, more recent reporting typically has better coverage. Not always, but at the very least, it's more detailed, it's more readily available. They can go back and fix things instead of just having to issue retractions that don't go anywhere near where you'd expect the retractions to be, and then you got to search for them, and sometimes they aren't there, and then you just want to cry. It's been a long week, guys. But on this case, at this point, that is all I have to say. Let me know in the comments if you think I missed anything, if there's any folklore stories in the area we should have looked at, because we might go up and, actually go check out the trails. This is not a hard drive for us. It's maybe 5 hours. So we might go and do that this summer, get out of the house a little bit, get on the road, maybe for Patreon, which, speaking of, if you want to support what we're doing here at the channel, you can check us out on Patreon. It's $1 a month. We're trying to be better about adding the exclusive content, but that includes Liquored Lore, which is where we get silly and talk about something that happened in the past, whether it's real or not. We also have all of the scripts that are getting uploaded very slowly. Right now, there are several. You can also just buy access to that for $25 once. If you're not feeling a $1 a month subscription, I will tell you, unless you're subscribed for a full 2 years at the $1 tier, you're saving money not doing the $25 subscription or one-time payment. It's really up to you. Maybe I'm just hoping that you'll subscribe and forget about it, because then we make $1 a month. It's kind of like what gyms do, but they do that for $40 a month. You can also support us by checking out our merch, as I said earlier in the video. That is at bunkerbranding.com, or by buying our coffee at Tableau Roasting Co. We did not pick one off a Shopify shelf and rebrand it. I told him exactly what I wanted. I even gave him roast temperatures. But if you're simply looking for more Lodge, first of all, join the Discord, because that is where all announcements go out the fastest for everything, and, YouTube isn't great about the notification bell. So there's that. But we also have the Weird Bible podcast with Wendigoon. We have History Unhinged with Stephen Bell of History of Everything and Stukuyi. And we have my personal channel, where I mostly stream on Friday nights. playing video games, often ones that you or the people I stream with have requested, and then getting very frustrated when the people I'm playing with are not exactly great at following the objective. Looking at you, Flaw. And last but not least, we do have our Monday night live show at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. That also goes on to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, as does this show now. We have started uploading those to the Lore Lodge. The live show is the Lore Lads, and I'm rebranding that here on YouTube as well to make everything easy. All right, I think that's everything. I have not eaten today. It is what time? Is it almost 5? It's almost 5 o'clock p.m. I haven't eaten. I need to go eat food. I'm Aiden Mattis. I love you all, and thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.